AI security, insider risks, Copilot security, all these things keep coming up. And Microsoft Purview is the 365 brand that helps you manage those. In this show, I'm joined by Elena Pachowska, security consultant at Threatscape, who's an absolute master of all things Purview, and she is going to take us through things like Microsoft's Secure by Design initiative with data security, discovering shadow AI use, and contending with risky internal users. Let's go. So, Elena, tell me what the most commonly misunderstood thing about Microsoft Purview is.
I think the most popular misconception about Microsoft Purview is the fact that you cannot actually do it right. But I think that I truly believe that you can. It just takes time, and obviously you need to follow that crawl, walk, and run approach and take your time in trying to determine what is supposed to be the right compliance posture for your organization. Make sure that you've got the user training right, and communicate all the changes that you are trying to implement to the end users.
So you raise a really interesting point there. You raise that crawl, walk, run kind of methodology, and that's something Microsoft have been talking about with things like sensitivity labels for quite a while now. But there's also been some kind of change in the guidance recently, right? And you've written about this where crawl, walk, run is, keep me right here, kind of being superseded by secure by default or something similar to that. What's the kind of latest guidelines on how folks can get Purview, sensitivity labels, and things right?
Correct. So we're kind of swerving a little bit from that crawl, walk, and run approach to kind of secure your security posture, your compliance by default, right? So it is literally called secure by default with Microsoft Purview, and it's the guidance provided by the engineering team at Microsoft. So they came up with a label taxonomy to help customers set up their sensitivity labels, make sure that you've got preventative measures in place to make sure that there are no data leakage or data exfiltration going on within your organization. So what they are basically recommending is that you set up your labels and straight away set up your data loss prevention policy. And by default, you set your default sensitivity labels to a label that would be encrypted. And they kind of recommend that you set it to a confidential all employees, which will make sure that by default, everything that is being sent both internally and externally, by default, it's just labeled as confidential all employees, which means that it shouldn't be leaving the organization. So Microsoft's recommendation is to teach your end users how to manage the exceptions to that rule so that your environment is secure by default, as the name says, but then your end users then decide whether an email or a file that they are trying to send externally, whether that should be one of the exceptions, and then how to change that label to something different.
Wow, so that's quite a big change, right? Like
It is.
I want to make sure I really understand that. So the kind of the default recommendation now for a lot of organizations, a lot of orgs, is going to be encrypt everything by default, and then only in that exception that you need to send it externally, you have to opt out of the encryption. Am I understanding that properly?
Correct. And then obviously Microsoft is trying to focus on the fact that you should be labeling your containers. So containers being your SharePoint sites or Microsoft Teams, your Microsoft 365 groups and stuff like that. So you can actually put a label on a repository of files at that kind of high level, right? And then you can still avail of the option to label individual files within that data repository as well.
Right. Okay. Gotcha. And I guess in your experience when it comes to deploying sensitivity labels and all that good stuff to customers, do you think that that's achievable, going encryption by default? And the reason I ask that is a lot of the customers I work with, maybe more than half of the email they're sending will be to domains that they've got no trust relationship with, right? It's external. So while secure by default makes sense in a philosophical point of view, right? And certainly in terms of the secure future initiative, is that practical for most orgs? What do you think?
Personally, I don't think so. And that's the main reason why I wrote that blog post about my initial thoughts about what the engineering team at Microsoft was after uploading. From experience, I don't think you should be rushing into this, right? That's first of all, and encrypting everything by default is going to be very, very hard to implement because essentially you're just changing the way that your end users are going to work, right? So that's why I mentioned at the start that user training is going to be pretty much the key thing here, right? Because you need to teach them what those labels are, how to use them, how to change them. But also one of the recommendations that Microsoft was after providing was the fact that they would only give the co-author permissions for the sensitivity labels for the entire organization, right? But that kind of causes issues in the long run where the users find themselves needing to manage those exceptions and they, for example, need to change that label to something different, right? So with the co-author permission, that's not sufficient enough to give them that option at all. So they would need to have co-owner to be able to do this. So it is something that I raised within my blog post as well. So to answer your question, in short, I don't agree with that idea 100%. I think, it's about time that people focus on Microsoft Purview. It is definitely an underappreciated solution within that entire Microsoft 365 stack, but you kind of need to get the basics right, I think, and maybe encrypting everything by default from the get-go might not be the best idea.
Okay, I got you. I follow. And one of the things you kind of mentioned there was Purview as a whole is often overlooked within that full E3 or E5 license. It's kind of often the last thing that customers will get to in terms of what they're deploying. They'll deploy Intune, Defender, they'll obviously deploy Intra, and then Purview is kind of like, well, I've done all that stuff, now I better tackle Purview. Within Purview itself, what's the kind of what's the maturity model that you see, right? So what's the first thing within Purview that folks go to? What's the second thing, the third thing, and so on? And is there anything hidden within Purview that folks also often overlook as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would always say that a good starting point would be to look at your sensitive information and what you've got in place. So you need to know where your data is, what your sensitive data is, and where it resides, right? So you need to focus on that data classification and then move on to Microsoft Information Protection. So after you just quickly assess, where your data resides, what sort of sensitive information types you've got, then you need to start with your sensitivity labels, because without that baseline, unfortunately, you cannot have a proper data loss prevention structure, or maybe you don't really have insider risk management configured properly. To give you an example, right? Just the fact that you might have a sensitivity label in place, let's say even if it's something confidential, all employees, for example, right? If you've just got that classification in place without having let's say a data loss prevention on top of it, saying that, okay, if a user within my organization is trying to share an email or a file labeled confidential all employees, as the name says, it shouldn't really leave the organization because it's intended for that internal consumption. So straight away, my thought process would be, okay, let's set up a data loss prevention policy and let's make sure that the end users cannot actually send an email or a file externally with that specific label on it.
Right. Okay. I think I follow. And would that be the reason you would do that rather than just encrypting the label outright? Would that be basically to reduce your risk, right? Because if I start encrypting stuff, it might break processes and all the rest of it. But if I'm understanding what you're saying, the idea is if you want to start slow, start with the classification and then layer all the protections after that and after you're seeing what your data flows are. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I would say you can still label your containers, or if you have that EF level of license, whether it's E5, A5, F5 and stuff like that, that gives it that auto labeling feature, then go for it, label as much of your kind of data repository sitting in SharePoint as you can. But I would still suggest that make sure your labels are in place and then put in all those different layers of protection on top of it. So make sure you fully utilize your level of license as well. If you're paying for it, why not use it?
Okay, I gotcha. And sticking on that theme of the labeling then, in all your experience of helping customers out with it, what's the big mistake that folks keep making with labels, right? Because it's one of those things that to me, when I've worked with it, it appears kind of simple to begin with, but it doesn't take long when you're configuring labels where you could really make a mistake. So is there any kind of quick tips that our viewers and listeners could take away to make sure, hey, I better not do that with my sensitivity labels?
A couple of things that I can probably think of is to make sure that you've got the permissions right. Okay, so I mentioned that co-owner permission. So that will allow you to change the label of a document or an email, or even decrypt that encrypted data, right? So in case someone leaves the organization, or maybe someone that was the author or the owner of that file is not available and someone needs to change that label. So make sure that you've got those permissions right, and think about all the possible scenarios, right? Another thing that I can think of is probably just making sure that if you are communicating with people outside of the organization, right? If you do want to encrypt those files or those documents that would go externally, you need to think about any possible compatibility issues, right? So not everyone is going to use Microsoft 365. Not everyone would have that integration for rights management or information protection. So maybe think of a scenario where if you do need to encrypt it, maybe do it with a recipient-only label. But other than that, make sure that the stuff sent externally is not encrypted. Or if you want to go down that road of making sure that it is encrypted because maybe you're dealing with highly sensitive data, then you can go very granular with the level of permission. So you have an option to specify the different domains that you would be communicating with as well, and give them permissions whether they can only view that stuff, whether they can edit the documents that you are sending them, and stuff like that.
Okay. And I guess that kind of leads me on to another train of thought I had, where one of the big reasons you would use sensitivity labels is to protect against kind of insiders exfiltrating data, right? Where if I go down the route of secure by default, encrypt everything with a company only label, if I then send all that stuff to my personal inbox, if I'm doing conditional access right, I can't access those files, right? Need to be from a compliant device or whatever. I'm also aware that within that E5 license or E5 compliance, however you get it, there's insider risk management. And so at what point should organizations start looking to use insider risk management? What's the key use cases for that solution?
And once you've got labels in place, I think there's nothing kind of stopping you from setting up data loss prevention and insider risk management. So you can kind of do it at the same time. You don't need to have data loss prevention in place to be able to use insider risk management. Once you have that level of license, and once you've got your prerequisites covered, then I would say absolutely 100% set up your insider risk management policies once you've got your global insider risk settings properly configured, and make sure that there's no insider threats going on within your organization, right? So insider threats, this could be your employees, your contractors, anyone basically with access to your tenant.
And so when it comes to detecting those risks, what's the sources, right? So for example, you mentioned detecting like maybe a contractor doing something they shouldn't be doing. Is it just reaching into the Office 365 management APIs and pulling out logs and all that kind of stuff? Like what's the limits of what it can and can't detect?
Great question. I mean, the Purview that we see, or even insider risk management that we see now, is not the same solution that we saw, let's say, a year ago or 2 years ago. So folks at Microsoft are constantly trying to improve that solution and make sure that they provide us with many new different capabilities. So at the moment, apart from accessing stuff within that Microsoft 365, you also have an option to connect things like Dropbox, Box, all those external sources as well. You can also connect through APIs. You can make sure that you export your logs from insider risk management to a SIEM solution. You can also integrate it with Defender XDR for that centralized management of all the different alerts and incidents going on as well. So there are a couple of different prerequisites, and obviously depending what you are actually doing in terms of are your devices onboarded to Microsoft Purview, for that endpoint kind of DLP element, and whether you are pushing out the Microsoft Purview extension to any other browser than Microsoft Edge, which is the native one and doesn't need a browser extension, right? So it can collect all the different telemetry off of people's devices once they are onboarded to Microsoft Purview, and also can collect all the telemetry from people's web browsers, right? So if they do upload stuff to their personal, maybe OneDrive or Dropbox, WeTransfer, all that good stuff that is available online, then it is also going to have it as one of the triggers for the policies that you are going to be setting up as well.
Okay, great. And that you mentioned the Defender XDR integration. So insider risk management can kind of tell the attack story in the same way that like Defender for Endpoint and all these other Defender tools can, where, your insider this was maybe the first thing they did, and then they did this, that, and the next thing. You get that kind of visual representation over with the Defender integration.
Correct. And what's actually really great about insider risk management is that once you configure your global insider risk settings, you do have a specific setting for what is called the policy timeframes, right? So you can set it up in a way that from the triggering event, it can also look at the last 90 days and also can look at the future kind of 30 days as well. So it means that if you set up an insider risk management policy, right, given that you've got all the prerequisites covered, if there is some kind of an exfiltration happening on a user's device or within a web browser, right, it's going to create an alert for you, but it's also going to go back. So it acts in retrospect, and it's going to look back at the last 90 days and look at that user history. So it will look for different types of sequences, maybe detections, what those users were doing, what kind of brought on that triggering event that happened on that day one.
Okay, so this is really cool. And this is something that you and I discussed a little while ago, where I guess the idea here is either if I've had an incident or, you know what, I just finally get around to enabling this tool, because it can go back 90 days, I think you said, I can immediately get value and I can immediately get risk detections and all the rest of it, right? I don't have to sit and wait a little while for it to gather that. It's just good to go.
Correct. Yeah. And you've got different interfaces as well. So you've got a graphical interface if you want to look at that history of what's been happening on the graph. You can go through that whole user history as well. So there are a couple of different tabs when you are investigating or triaging different alerts and incidents within insider risk management, where you can actually see what exactly happened. So what was that first activity, and then look at all the other activities that maybe didn't generate any alert, but you get that full history of what that user was doing if you do want to maybe pay a closer attention to that activity going on that user side.
Right. And if if I'm doing my investigation and I'm like, okay, no, this does look like the user's up to no good, what are the kind of things I can then do about it? Right. So is there built-in remediation? Is that manual? What would the response side of this look like?
I mean, it kind of depends, right? If you do use something like Power Automate, you can automate that remediation. If you don't, then you can manually try and remediate the different incidents happening. So you can block that user, for example. You can create cases if you deal or if you're in that legal space, for example, and you want to do a proper investigation, you can build a case, and if you're taken to court or there's something kind of going on as well, you can have it as an evidence of what that user was doing.
Right. Okay. And I guess, keep me honest here, but earlier you mentioned you can integrate it with Sentinel. So I guess you're only limited by Sentinel's SOAR capabilities. So if you want to throw a logic app or something on it by integrating it there, it's kind of like, you can customize this thing. I don't want to say infinitely, but there's a whole bunch of options there. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it just depends what solution you use. Obviously, if you're all Microsoft 365, it's a lot easier for you because of that centralized management, right? So you can manage everything from a single portal. And then if you've got Logic app set up, if you use Sentinel, if you use Defender XDR, that's a lot easier for you than, let's say, if you were using a different anti-malware solution, or if you were using the likes of Curator and stuff like that.
Okay. And this whole kind of conversation brings me on to the other recurring theme that you kind of see it everywhere now, right? But you especially see it as a concern. And when you see these reports and it says, what are CISO's top security concerns? And over the last year and a half, 2 years, AI, generative AI, LLM, is just everywhere, right? It's kind of getting, it's nonstop. And obviously the Purview / Defender for Cloud Apps side of the Microsoft security organization, they've clearly taken notice of that. And we start to see a whole bunch of AI security tools, right, within Purview and also within Defender for Cloud Apps, like I said. What are some of the key things then that Purview can do in that AI space that would help with customers' concerns?
Great question. So there's something called the AI Hub within the Purview Admin Center. It's currently in preview, but it's looking really good. You can basically get different types of reports on that AI usage within your company, right? So if you use Copilot licenses, you can have a look at what your users are kind of using, whether they are using that Copilot license, how many prompts they're sending. There's some exciting stuff kind of coming into Purview soon enough that we cannot quite talk about just yet. But for example, with communication compliance, which is another kind of E5 level of Purview solution, you can set up a policy that will let you detect Copilot interactions, and you can track whether people are uploading any sensitive information to Copilot for Microsoft 365. And obviously, with Copilot for security, and I hope the name still stands because they keep changing it, but within that Purview admin portal as well, just similar to the security admin portal, right? You can get a Copilot for security to summarize all the different incidents and alerts and give you an overview of what was happening. So for example, if we go back to that scenario of trying to manage an incident within insider risk management, you can get Copilot for security to tell you that whole story, what exactly happened, what was that triggering event, what were the maybe most risky activities going on users' devices.
Right, that's cool. And if I think about the AI Hub and how it kind of exposes, you mentioned the different AI systems that users would touch. Is that going to be reliant on things like something you also mentioned, which would be the Purview extension for third-party browsers? Is it just pulling in from these types of data sources?
Correct. Yeah. So it's giving you a nice overview of different Gen AI tools that your users might be using as well. So kind of similar in that sense to Microsoft Defender for cloud apps and how it does that cloud discovery piece as well. So AI Hub does something similar.
Right, so it's like if Defender for cloud apps did shadow IT discovery, this is like shadow AI discovery, right? Where it's saying, here's all these different... Right, okay, I gotcha. And thinking that through a little bit more, to me, again, you see headlines all the time of, I'll take Samsung as an example, just ban AI entirely, right? Unless it's their own systems, right? So you can't use ChatGPT and so on and so forth. No third-party AI. You see a lot of organizations doing that. If you keep me right here, my assumption is that if a user is using something like Google Gemini or something, Purview, Defender for Cloud Apps, they're not going to be able to see the specific queries that I'm using within those, right? Because we're not doing HTTPS inspection or anything like that, right? We're just looking at the websites. It sounds to me like, therefore, the argument is kind of, well, people are going to use AI anyway, right? If you think they're not, then you've banned it. Well, you're too trusting of your users, right? It sounds to me like if you're a Microsoft 365 shop, it's like, well, sure, you could ban all these other AI sources, but at least if you let your users use something like Microsoft Copilot, you get that visibility, right? So that it's like, hey, we know you're going to use it. Use the one that we can audit and monitor rather than going away and using this shadow AI that we've got no control over. Is that something you're kind of, is that fair to say? And is that something that your customers are also kind of seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, as you said, you cannot really stop people from using AI because these are the types of tools that are available everywhere. And if everyone else is using them, why would you prohibit your own end users from doing that, right? So kind of getting that Copilot license might be beneficial to your end users. What we sometimes see in organizations that do deploy Copilot for Microsoft 365, for example, or even Copilot for security is that they block all other Gen AI tools that are out there. Purview is kind of quite good with that as well. So is Defender in terms of you can kind of track risky activities. You can track at what websites your users are visiting and stuff like that. So if you do kind of want to be very restrictive about it, then I would say just purchase the Copilot for Microsoft 365 license and block all the other AI tools. There are some exciting features coming into that whole Purview stack soon enough that I'm really excited about. Cannot really tell you too much about it just yet, but there might be a little bit more than just Copilot for Microsoft 365 and the way that you can protect your data, regardless where it's kind of going or where it's being uploaded.
Cool. Watch out for Ignite, I guess, is the big tease there, right? Hopefully we'll see some cool new stuff there. Ignite's always exciting. And I kind of, I don't want to say I feel bad, but when you're talking to folks within the product teams at Microsoft, you can just tell there's this enormous level of stress in the month preceding Ignite because we got to get a lot of stuff ready to announce. But yeah, like you said, a lot of cool stuff that we can expect. And I'll tell you what, trying to merge some of the themes of our discussion so far, spoken about sensitivity labels and DLP, spoken about insider risk management and AI security. My understanding is that Copilot can reason over data that is protected by sensitivity labels, but it still respects those sensitivity labels, right? Is that I don't want to stumble about and I want to make sure I'm getting things right there. But for example, if I'm a customer and I was scared to turn on Copilot for whatever reason. If my content is encrypted using these labels, that does give me some degree of reassurance. Is that the case?
100%. So it will all depend on the level of permissions that your users have to that encrypted content. So perhaps if you don't want specific business departments to be able to see maybe some of the most confidential data that you are dealing with, then make sure that you have maybe separate labels or separate permissions for different business units within your organization, because essentially you want to get those sensitivity labels and those permissions right, so that when someone, whether it's done in a malicious manner or maybe accidental without them even knowing, you want to make sure that those sensitivity labels protect your sensitive data from being read, accessed, and exfiltrated by the likes of Copilot or any other Gen AI tool as well.
Right. Okay. And I'll tell you what, one of the reasons I asked that question is because I'm thinking back to one of the first things we were talking about, right, is the Secure by Design initiative where we encrypt by default. And I'm thinking of the Copilot implications there. And it's like, personally, I kind of lean towards what you're saying, where if I'm a organization of any scale, it's going to be really hard to justify just having a label that encrypts everything by default, right? That's such a huge culture change. I guess what you could maybe start looking at, therefore, is per department. If you're a particularly sensitive department, thinking like, HR or kind of departments like that, who by their very nature, payroll's a great example. You're working with sensitive nature by the data you're working with is just always going to be sensitive, right? With exclusions. So you could potentially take that secure by default initiative and just kind of scale it back a little bit, right? And do it per department. And that might alleviate some data security in general, but more specifically Copilot security concerns, right?
Yeah, correct. I agree. Yeah, it's definitely something that you can do if you don't want to use that secure by default framework that Microsoft is recommending, but you still want to make sure that maybe your most sensitive data is still encrypted and it cannot just go into the wrong hands, basically.
Okay, gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. Well, this has really helped me kind of demystify and clarify the direction of the system, because as someone who's been working with AIP, can we still call it AIP? I don't really know.
Yes,
I know it uses AIP.
That, yeah.
It's AIP under the hood, isn't it? Right? It's like, yeah. So I think, is it like the underlying technology is still AIP, but the presentation layer is like sensitivity labels, something like that. It gets quite confusing.
Microsoft.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Oh, we got to get that obligatory jab in there at the Microsoft renaming folks. No, but this conversation's really helped me kind of clarify the direction of the recommendations for the deployments of it, and then also some of the cool stuff that they're doing with insider risk and AI and all the rest of it. So really appreciate your time joining me on the podcast. If folks want to find you online, read your blog, you post a ton of great stuff on. I mean, you've got like this incredible deep dive into exact data match, I think it was, you did a series on, and that's just so hard to find. That's such a niche topic, but you really nailed it. If folks want to find that online and connect with you, what's the best place to do it?
Sure. So I'm mostly active on LinkedIn, so you can just search by my name. I'm also active on Twitter, and I run a blog, so you can find me on Twitter at wellcatsworld, and my blog is wellcatsworld.com. And maybe to wrap it up, Ro, thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yep, no, always happy to have you on. I work with what I can only imagine is the best Microsoft security team in the world. I say that all the time, and it's like, well, of course you would say it, right? Because it's your team and all the rest of it. But I really do believe it, right? The kind of work that you do on not just Purview, but Microsoft 365 and Microsoft security in general is really, really impressive. And it's kind of second to none. So again, thanks for joining me and sharing your wisdom with our audience. Appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.